Your savings are better in my hands." That was what my son told me, without hesitation, without shame. It was a sentence that felt like a blade, quick and sharp, slicing into the quiet comfort I thought I had built for myself in my old age. At 72, I've lived through losses, labors, and long nights of worry. I've worked hard, stretched every dollar, pinched pennies where it counted. And in that one smug declaration, he stripped my life's effort down to something he believed belonged to him. I sat across from him at my own kitchen table, the one I had polished and scrubbed for decades, the one where his father and I had shared meals, celebrated birthdays, and counseled him through heartbreaks. He leaned back in the chair as if it were a throne, confidence dripping from his voice, as though my security, my savings, was nothing more than a toy he deserved to play with. "You don't really need it," he added, almost casually, like he was doing me a favor. "You've had your time. Let me handle things. I'll make it grow. I'll do more with it than you ever could." The words stung not only for their arrogance, but for what they implied, that I was finished, that my years no longer mattered, that the sacrifices of my past could be dismissed with a wave of his hand. To him, my money was wasted in the hands of a 72-year-old woman. I didn't answer right away. My throat tightened, my lips pressed together. The quiet between us was heavy, filled with all the things I wanted to say but couldn't, at least not then. He mistook my silence for surrender. He smiled, satisfied, as though the matter was settled simply because he had declared it so. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. A lifetime of endurance taught me restraint. I'd held my tongue through smaller insults before. When he called me old-fashioned for clipping coupons, when he rolled his eyes at the way I held on to things others would have thrown away. But this wasn't about a coupon or a cracked teapot. This was my future. Inside, something stirred. A spark. It wasn't fiery rage, at least not yet. It was quieter than that, deeper. A small but undeniable current of resistance that ran through me. He thought I would fold easily. He thought my age had softened me into weakness. He had no idea how much strength a woman like me could still hold. That moment, those words, settled in me like a stone. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I let the silence stand between us like a wall. I knew better than to fight him on the spot. He would only twist my words, laugh at my worry, tell me I was overreacting. But in that silence, I made a promise to myself. I would endure the sting for now. I would sit with the insult, carry it inside, and let it harden into resolve. He would not see me break. For the first time in my life, I looked at my son not as the boy I had raised, but as a man who had forgotten who his mother was. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that this conversation was only the beginning. He thought my savings were better in his hands. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. I suppose I should tell you who I am so you'll understand how much those words cut into me. My name is Margaret. I am 72 years old, a widow for the last 10. I spent most of my life as a school teacher, teaching history to restless children who believed the past was boring until I made them see it alive. My husband, George, used to say I had a gift for keeping things steady, the classroom, the house, our life. We never had much, but we had enough. I learned early how to stretch a dollar. My parents were Depression-era folks, the kind who saved bits of string and folded grocery bags neatly for reuse. That blood runs in me, too. Every paycheck, I tucked a little away, not in flashy investments or risky schemes, but in solid, dependable accounts. Security was what I craved, not excitement. I built that nest egg not just for myself, but for peace of mind. When my husband passed, I thought the savings would be my lifeline, money to keep me in my home, to cover unexpected doctor's bills, to let me grow old without becoming a burden to anyone. I told myself I had done well. I told myself George would have been proud of how carefully I guarded what we built together. But my son, my only child, never seemed to see it that way. To him, my caution was old-fashioned, almost laughable. I still remember the first time he teased me in front of others. We were at his house for a family cookout, and I had brought along some Tupperware containers to pack leftovers, as I'd always done. His wife smirked, and he chuckled. "Mom, you and those containers, you're like a hoarder. Can't you just let things go?" The laughter stung, but I brushed it off. It wasn't the last time. There was the time he came with me to the grocery store. I had a handful of coupons carefully clipped from the Sunday paper. He rolled his eyes so dramatically that the cashier noticed. "Mom, you save a quarter here and a dime there. What's the point? Don't you know how small that is?" I didn't answer then either, but I thought about how those quarters and dimes collected over decades had grown into the account that kept a roof over my head. It went further. When he was in college, I co-signed his first car loan. He promised to pay it responsibly, and when he didn't, I quietly stepped in to keep his credit from being ruined. When he wanted to start his first business, I loaned him part of the inheritance I'd received after George's passing. That venture collapsed in a year, but I never asked for repayment. He was my son. That was reason enough. I poured into him not just money, but time, love, forgiveness. He took, always confident I would give. And I did, because that is what mothers do. But somewhere along the line, gratitude shifted into entitlement. What once was, "Thank you, Mom," became, "You'll help, right?" He stopped asking and started assuming. It was subtle at first, but the tone grew sharper over the years. I would watch him dismiss my ways of living as if I were a relic, a woman too stubborn to accept the modern way. He had the arrogance of someone who believed youth would last forever, who thought age was weakness instead of strength. I stayed silent because that's how I was raised. To endure, to avoid stirring conflict, to believe that patience would outlast arrogance. But silence, I learned, does not soften arrogance. It feeds it. So when he looked me in the eye that day at my kitchen table and said, "Your savings are better in my hands," it was not a sudden cruelty. It was the loudest echo of all those smaller slights, years of dismissals piled high, all crashing down into one bold insult. And as I sat in that silence, I felt the weight of my years, not as a weakness, but as a ledger of everything I had endured. I knew, then, that this wasn't just about money. It was about respect. It was about my worth as a woman who had lived, who had given, and who still mattered. He thought he was clever, disguising his greed as responsibility. But I had been watching him for years. I knew his weaknesses. He thought my age made me blind, but what it truly gave me was patience. And patience, I was beginning to realize, could be sharpened into a weapon. It wasn't long before the truth revealed itself. Cruel things have a way of stepping out into the light, even when the guilty try to keep them hidden. One morning, I went online to check my account balances. It was something I did every week, part habit, part reassurance. Only this time, the numbers didn't add up. My savings, what had taken me years to build, was drastically lower. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some error on the bank's part. I printed the statement and studied it, tracing each line with my finger. But there it was, clear as daylight. Transfers, large ones, all authorized by my son. He had taken it. I felt my chest tighten, a hollow ache settling under my ribs. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the image of him smiling at my kitchen table, telling me my savings were better in his hands. The audacity. He hadn't just been speaking in hypotheticals. He'd already made himself master of what wasn't his. That afternoon, I drove to his house. I needed to look him in the eye and hear his explanation, though deep down, I already knew. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't even make it to the front door before I saw it. The gleaming red sports car parked like a trophy. Its paint shone under the sun. Its chrome wheels glittered as though they belonged in a showroom. I stopped dead in my tracks. The car was not a necessity, not a family vehicle or a tool for work. It was a statement piece, a toy for a man who wanted to show off. My savings, my lifeline, sat on 4 wheels in his driveway. The door opened and he stepped out grinning like a boy with a new toy. "Do you like it, Mom?" he asked, gesturing at the car. "It's an investment. Cars like this hold their value, sometimes even go up. You wouldn't understand, but trust me, it's smart." His words barely registered. I felt dizzy, as if the ground had tilted under me. I clutched the bank statement in my hand, its edges crumpling as I tried to steady myself. "You bought this with my money?" I finally managed. My voice was low, tight, each word forced through clenched teeth. He shrugged, as if it were obvious. "Well, technically, I just moved it. You weren't using it, and honestly, you shouldn't be keeping that much sitting around. I'll make it work harder. Look at this beauty. Don't you want me to enjoy life while I still can? You've had your turn." That sentence, "you've had your turn," was the final blow. All the justifications, all the arrogance, funneled into that one brutal dismissal. He wasn't doing this for me or even for the family. He did it for himself, because he believed my years no longer counted. I looked at the car, at him, at the papers in my hand. The denial I had been holding on to cracked wide open. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding, no generous son trying to help. It was theft dressed up as entitlement. "You had no right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He rolled his eyes, a boy again, sulking at being scolded. "Don't be dramatic, Mom. I'll take care of you. You'll thank me later." But I didn't feel taken care of. I felt stripped, robbed not just of money, but of dignity. In that moment, a clarity settled over me. Whatever illusions I had held about his intentions were gone. I saw him plain without the blur of motherly love that had softened his edges for so long. He had betrayed me, not just as a son, but as the man I had trusted with a piece of my future. I said nothing more. I turned and walked back to my car. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I drove home, but my mind was clear. The truth had surfaced, undeniable and sharp. And once truth arrives, denial cannot live beside it. The night after seeing that car, I sat in my living room without turning on the lights. The house was dark except for the faint glow from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows on the walls. I should have gone to bed, but sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red paint gleaming in his driveway, and I heard his voice, "You've had your turn." The words played on a loop, hollowing me out. I stared at my hands resting in my lap. They were not the hands of a young woman anymore. The veins showed clearly, the skin thinner now. But those hands had cooked meals, grated papers late into the night, scrubbed floors, held my husband's when he was ill, and cradled my son when he was small enough to fit against my chest. These were not useless hands. They were my history, my strength. And yet my own son had dismissed me as though my time had passed, as if the only value left in me was in what I could hand over. A wave of despair washed over me, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone. George was gone. My sisters had passed on, and the friends I had were scattered, wrapped up in their own struggles. I had always believed that at the very least my son would be my ally in these later years. Instead, he had become the one to wound me deepest. I thought of calling someone, maybe an old friend from church, but I didn't want to explain. Shame crept in alongside the grief. What would I even say? That my only child had stolen from me. That I, the woman who once prided herself on teaching responsibility, had raised a man who thought so little of his mother's worth? The clock ticked, marking each hour of my sleepless night. With every passing minute, the sorrow shifted slightly. It was as if despair, left too long in the body, begins to harden into something else. By dawn, the tears had dried on my cheeks. My chest still ached, but under that ache was a slow, deliberate burn. Anger, yes, but not the wild kind that makes you reckless. This anger was different. It was sharp, clear. I realized something as I sat there watching the first light of morning creep across the floorboards. Despair is a place you can drown in if you choose. But anger, the right kind of anger, can be a life raft. I refused to remain powerless. I stood and walked into the kitchen, the same place where my son had sat days earlier, so smug, declaring my savings better in his hands. I placed my palms flat on the table and leaned forward, whispering aloud into the empty room, "No more." Those words echoed back at me in the silence, and for the first time in weeks, I felt steady. I wasn't foolish. I knew reclaiming what was mine wouldn't be simple. He was bold, arrogant, and convinced of his own superiority. But I had something he didn't: patience, experience, and a lifetime of navigating challenges that would have crushed him. The breaking point had come and gone. I had sat in the dark, tasted despair, and decided not to swallow it. Now came the harder part, the part where silence would end and action would begin. I may have been 72. I may have been widowed, living alone in a house too quiet at times. But I was not finished, and I was not weak. I would not let my son decide that my story had ended. And so, with my heart bruised, but my spirit firming like steel, I began to think not of what he had taken, but of what I was about to reclaim. The days that followed tested me in ways I hadn't imagined. My son, perhaps emboldened by what he thought was my silence, became bolder. He paraded that car through town, taking it to family gatherings, posting photographs online for everyone to see. It wasn't just transportation to him, it was proof, a glittering badge of his supposed success. Relatives called me, their voices tinged with curiosity and judgment. "I heard you let him handle your finances, Margaret. Isn't it nice to have someone take care of you?" Take care of me. As if I were some helpless old woman who had surrendered her independence. I bit my tongue and let them believe what he wanted them to. But inside, each call was another needle pressing into my pride. He bragged openly, not realizing his arrogance was building a wall between us. "Mom's set now," I overheard him say to his cousin at a gathering, puffing up like a rooster. "She doesn't need to worry about anything. I've got it all handled. She trusts me with everything." Trust. The word caught in my throat like glass. He wasn't just stealing from me quietly. He was rewriting the story of who I was, painting me as weak and dependent so he could look powerful. The stakes grew heavier with each passing week. Bills arrived, and I felt the pressure of my reduced accounts. What if a medical emergency came? What if the roof needed repair? My carefully built safety net had been slashed, leaving me exposed, and worse than money was dignity. The whispers among family, the sideways glances, the assumption that I had handed over my hard-earned savings willingly, it all threatened to erase the woman I knew myself to be. I saw him less as a son, and more as a gambler at a table, growing more reckless with each hand he thought he'd won. He had no idea that the deck was shifting. One afternoon he dropped by unannounced, strutting into my home as if it were his. "I'm thinking about moving some of your funds into a new opportunity," he said, brushing crumbs from my counter as though he were already in charge. "There's this partnership I heard about. Good returns, quick turnaround. Don't worry, I'll take care of the details." I said nothing. Silence had become my mask, the curtain behind which my plans were forming. He mistook it for weakness again. He smiled, patted my shoulder, and said, "Don't stress, Mom. Just enjoy yourself. You don't have to think about these things anymore." His arrogance was my alarm bell. If I did nothing, I would lose not just what remained of my savings, but also control of my life. He was already positioning himself as master of my finances, my choices, my future. I knew what was at stake now: my independence, my place in my own home, my very identity. At 72, I could not afford to surrender those things, not to anyone, and certainly not to the boy I had raised, now grown into a man who thought his mother's years gave him the right to strip her of her voice. He drove away that afternoon, the roar of the sports car echoing down the street, leaving me in silence again. But it wasn't the silence of despair this time. It was the silence before a storm, the kind that gathers power quietly before it breaks. He thought I would remain still while he carved pieces of my life away. He thought my age meant submission, that my silence meant surrender. But he hadn't noticed the shift in me, the way grief had hardened into resolve. The stakes were no longer just financial. If I did nothing, I would vanish into the role he had cast for me. The fragile mother tucked safely under his control, her worth reduced to the balance in an account she no longer owned. I would not play that role. And so, as he sped off into his borrowed glory, I stood in my doorway with one thought clear as crystal. If he believed he had already won, then he was about to learn what it meant to underestimate me. If my son thought I would sit idly by while he dismantled my security, he had forgotten who raised him. I did not shout, and I did not storm into his driveway with accusations. I had learned, over many years of teaching and of living, that the loudest voice isn't always the strongest. Real strength is quiet, deliberate, and careful. So I began my work in silence. The first step was a visit to the bank. I walked in with my folder of documents, statements, identification, the evidence of the transfers he had made. The young man behind the desk glanced at me the way clerks often do at someone my age, with polite patience, but also with the assumption that I wouldn't understand the fine print. That was his first mistake. I had spent my life balancing ledgers, clipping coupons, and reconciling every receipt. I knew the language of money, even if it was written in small print. I need everything in my name, I told him, steady and clear. No joint access, no outside permissions. Lock it down. He tapped at his keyboard, hesitated, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. We can secure your accounts. One domino moved. Next, I called a lawyer. Not a flashy one in a glass office downtown, but a woman recommended by a neighbor, sharp, discreet, and practical. She listened without interruption as I explained what had happened. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "You still have more power than you think." Together, we drew up papers, legal protections, property title transfers, and clauses that made it clear what was mine would remain mine. My son had used my trust to slip in through the cracks, but I was sealing every one of them. Still, the car was the sorest wound. Every time I thought of it, I felt the insult anew, the way he had flaunted it, shining and loud, a monument to his arrogance bought with my sacrifice. That, too, needed addressing. Through the lawyer's guidance, I learned exactly how the purchase had been funded. It was not some clever investment. It was my money, plain and simple. And because of that, I had the right to reclaim it. The process wasn't simple. Forms to file, calls to make, negotiations to press. But piece by piece, the steps aligned. Arrangements were quietly made with a buyer who didn't ask questions. By the time the ink dried, the sports car was no longer his. It felt almost poetic, knowing that. The object of his pride was being dismantled without his knowledge. While he preened and boasted, I was unspooling his illusion, strand by strand. Back at home, I changed the locks. It was not an act of paranoia, but of protection. He had grown too comfortable waltzing into my space, declaring what he would do with my future. My home was my sanctuary, the one place where I still decided who crossed the threshold. Now only I held the keys. Each step I took was like laying bricks in a wall between us, quiet, firm, and necessary. He still believed I was sitting in the role he had assigned me, silent, dependent, naive. He had no idea I was constructing something behind the curtain of my calm. There were nights when doubt crept in, whispering that I was being too harsh, that perhaps I should forgive again, that a mother ought to bear her child's mistakes. But those voices faded when I remembered the gleam of that car and the sting of his words. You've had your turn. Forgiveness, I realized, is not the same as surrender. I could forgive him in my heart someday, perhaps, but I could not surrender my dignity. And so I pressed forward, step after step, brick after brick. By the time I finished, everything that was mine had been secured, and the weapon he thought he held, my money, my future, was already slipping out of his grasp. He was blind to it all, striding about in his borrowed confidence, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting. He thought his mother was too old, too soft, too slow to protect herself. He thought my silence meant defeat. What he didn't see was the strategy building in the quiet. What he didn't hear was the strength gathering in the silence. Soon, very soon, the silence would break. The morning arrived like any other, sunlight spilling through the curtains, the hum of birds outside, but I felt the weight of what was coming. My son was due over, though not by invitation. He came often now, unannounced, with the confidence of someone who believed the house, the money, even my time belonged to him. Only this morning would be different. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before the knock at the door. My heart quickened, but I steadied myself. When I opened it, there he was, grinning, keys dangling in his hand, ready to take his prized car for another joyride. Except the driveway was empty, his brow furrowed instantly. He stepped past me without asking, peering out the window as though the car might appear if he squinted hard enough. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice rising. I closed the door softly behind him. "Gone," I said simply. "What do you mean, gone?" His face reddened, the charm replaced by panic. "Mom, don't tell me it was stolen. How could you let this happen?" I walked calmly to the table and laid down a folder. Inside were receipts, transfer forms, and legal documents neatly stacked and undeniable. It wasn't stolen, it was sold, with my authorization, because it was bought with my money. For a moment he simply stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, gasping for air. Then he slammed his hand against the table. "You can't do that, that car is mine." I met his fury with stillness. "No, it was never yours. It was bought with what you took from me, and now it is settled." He paced the kitchen like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, then turned back with a sneer. "Unbelievable. You've completely lost it. You don't understand investments. You don't understand the future. You need me, Mom. Without me, you'll end up penniless and alone. Don't you see that?" I let him spit out his venom. Then I reached into the folder and slid the lawyer's letter across the table. "These are the documents securing everything else. My accounts, my property, my home. You no longer have access to any of it." The color drained from his face as he skimmed the page. He tried to laugh it off, but it cracked halfway through. This is ridiculous. You think a piece of paper will stop me? I'm your son. I'm entitled." "Stop." The word came sharp and clear, surprising even me with its firmness. "You are not entitled to anything. Not my money, not my home, not my peace. I gave you life, I gave you love, I gave you chance after chance. But entitlement ends here." His voice rose to a shout. "You can't just shut me out after everything I've done." "Everything you've done," I cut in, my voice steady but cold. "You drained my savings, you mocked my years, you told me my life was over so you could live yours louder. That is what you've done." The room grew tense, thick with his anger and my resolve. He slammed his fist on the table again, trying to shake me. But the years had taught me endurance, and endurance had hardened into steel. I did not flinch. Finally, I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on his. "Do you remember what you said to me? That my savings were better in your hands? That I'd had my turn?" He swallowed hard, saying nothing. I straightened, sliding the last document into place. "You were wrong. My savings are better in my hands. Always have been. Always will be." The words struck him harder than any shout could have. He stood there, red-faced, trembling with anger, but beneath it I saw the cracks of something else, shock, perhaps even fear. For the first time he understood that the power he thought he had was gone. There was nothing left for him to say. After a long, heavy silence, he turned and stormed out, the door rattling behind him. I listened to his footsteps fade, the empty driveway mocking him with every step. I stood in my kitchen, the silence now mine, not his. I had not raised my voice. I had not begged or pleaded. I had simply taken back what was mine, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for him to hold over me. And in that moment, I felt unshaken. The house was still after he left, but not in the same way it had been in those nights of despair. Then the silence had felt heavy, suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. Now it felt clean, almost liberating. I walked slowly through each room, touching the furniture, the photographs, the walls that had stood through decades of my life. For the first time in months, maybe even years, the space felt mine again. The locks were changed, the accounts secured, the car gone, my dignity, too, reclaimed. It hadn't been easy, nothing about it was, but every quiet step I had taken led to this moment. I stood taller, not because my years had disappeared, but because I had leaned into them. Age had not made me weaker. It had armed me with the patience, the wisdom, and the resolve to protect myself when it mattered most. I thought back to the night I sat in the dark, thinking I might drown in despair. I remembered the sting of shame when relatives called, repeating his lies about how I had handed everything over. I remembered the hollowness when I saw that red sports car glinting in his driveway. Each wound was still there, a part of me, but they no longer bled. They had hardened into scars, and scars are proof not of defeat, but of survival. There were people who might say I was harsh, that a mother should forgive endlessly, that blood is thicker than betrayal. But here is what I know. Forgiveness without boundaries is not kindness. It is surrender. My son had mistaken my love for weakness, my silence for approval. He believed he could write me out of my own story, claim what was mine, and still expect me to bless him for it. I will always love the boy I raised. That love will never vanish, no matter how far he strays. But love does not mean blindness. Love does not mean allowing yourself to be stripped of dignity. And love certainly does not mean financing someone else's arrogance at the cost of your own survival. After the showdown, word spread quickly among the family. Some called to check on me, their voices cautious, testing the story they had heard from him. I told them the truth simply without shame. I took back what was mine, I said. Some were silent, perhaps stunned. Others whispered words of quiet admiration, though they didn't say them too loudly. But I didn't need their approval. My worth no longer depended on what anyone else believed. One afternoon, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The sun caught on the rim of the cup, and I felt an unfamiliar but welcome sensation. Peace. Not the fragile peace of keeping still so others don't make noise, but the sturdy peace of knowing I had acted, that I had defended what mattered. I thought about his words again. Your savings are better in my hands. How confidently he had said it, how smugly he believed it. Now I turned those words over in my mind, and they no longer stung. They had transformed into something else. Because the truth was this: my savings, my home, my future, my dignity, they were always better in my hands, in the hands of the woman who had built them with years of labor, of sacrifice, of careful patience, in the hands of the woman who had raised him, yes, but also the woman who had remembered her own worth just in time. I share this now because I know I am not the only one. Many of us, as we grow older, are told in subtle ways that our time is over, that our voices don't matter, that what we've built should be handed off to someone else. Sometimes it comes from strangers. Sometimes, painfully, it comes from those we love most. But I stand as proof. Age is not the closing of a door. It is the gathering of strength. We are not invisible. We are not finished. And we are never too old to draw a line and say, no more. So if you ever find yourself hearing those cruel words, that your time has passed, that what you have is better in someone else's hands, I hope you will remember me. Remember that 72 is not an ending. It is a vantage point. And from here, I see clearly what I have built, what I have earned, what I am. It is better in my hands, always in my hands.